Welcome to the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host, Tom Mason. Now recently I was going through a bunch of my old files and I came across the video series that I used to do called the Sculpting Archives. And I realized that I stopped very early on in my series of going over every sculpture I'd ever done. So the last one I posted was from 2006. And so when I was going through my files, I realized I had actually started production on the year 2007. And this is actually a big year. There was a lot more sculpts, and I actually have to break it up into 3 parts. So this is going to be the first part of this series for Sculpting Archives 2007. Watch, enjoy, and I hope you learned something. HOURMAN was the first in a set of 3 miniatures that I was given by WizKids to sculpt at the beginning of 2007. This character, along with the other 3, I wasn't really familiar with, so they gave me lots of reference, which is very helpful. But I had to do a lot of research too to kind of figure out how I needed to go about doing this character. WizKids had a really interesting thing when I was working with them, where they said even though they were licensed to do the HeroClix miniatures based on Marvel and DC, you weren't allowed to completely specifically sculpt a miniature based off of any particular comic reference. Like, you couldn't use the exact same pose or something like that, which I thought was basically ridiculous, because these characters are drawn so much that they basically have to have been drawn in every single pose. But came up with a pretty cool one. This guy flying through the air. It was a very interesting challenge, though, because you had that cape flowing, and I had to think about how he would be propped up on the flight stand that WizKids like to use. But it really taught me a lot, and I'm very grateful, though, that I didn't have to worry about doing any of my own cutting or parting of the miniature, because I had done a lot of cutting and parting before this, but I wasn't really that great at it yet. So it was very nice not to have to worry about it on this miniature. The second DC HeroClix miniature I sculpted was called Time Trapper. This is a pretty neat character. I hadn't done a lot of guys in robes, so it actually allowed me to sculpt this character pretty fast, because he's basically one giant robe. The neat, interesting kind of new thing that I got to do with this miniature was try and sculpt something, essentially a perfect cube, and it had different elements on the 6 sides. So that was a fun challenge with this character. But otherwise, he was pretty easy and straightforward. It was actually quite a welcome to be able to do that after having done the HOURMAN, which took a lot of time. The third and final figure I sculpted for WizKids DC HeroClix line was Major Disaster. This is if I recall correctly, he's a big supervillain for the Green Lantern. He has he's kind of a big, tough dude. I'm trying to remember all the details. He was supposed to be like a baseline thug, but somehow came into getting some sort of powers. And so this was my favorite of the 3. It was definitely more in my wheelhouse. I liked doing bigger, chunkier guys just with nice, powerful poses, and this character was a lot of fun to do, and I think he turned out great. The other 2, I'm not as happy with. This one, though, I think really holds up even nowadays. It was also really cool to see this miniature when he was actually finished, because he was molded in a clear plastic, and then the whole thing was painted. So when it was done, the little fireball or whatever that he's holding in his hand was, this translucent plastic. It was really cool. This miniature was done for a company called Dark Water Miniatures, although I think they changed their name during the time that I sculpted it to like level 6, or maybe it was the other way around. But this was a really neat character to work on. It was done by the concept art, and the owner of this company was a guy named Vamp, who had done a few, I think he had done a couple different miniature ventures from time to time, and then struck on his own, or maybe this was just the latest incarnation. And I had bought some of those miniatures. I was a big fan of them, and so it was really cool when he approached me to sculpt this. He was working on creating basically Chaos Warriors. I don't know if they were supposed to specifically be used for Games Workshop purposes, but they kind of have that theme, but definitely done in Vamp style. And this, I love this miniature. Now this miniature, he actually, I completed it, but he ended up not moving forward with the project, and so it was never cast. And actually, this is my sculpt. I have the rights to do with it as I will, but I've never got it molded either. So maybe I'll do it sometime. I think I never did that because even though it's a really good sculpt, I wasn't never sure how it would really fit in with what I was doing with all my other ideas and whatnot. So, but it's one of my favorite miniatures I've ever done. I think it's super crisp and clean, and certainly one of the best works I ever did in green stuff. So I don't know, maybe I'll release it someday. I used to entertain the idea of maybe converting it or changing it some to make it a little more something that I would be interested in having in my own line. But it's kind of a larger miniature as well as far as scale goes. So yeah, he's like 40 miniatures tall or so, but still really nice figure to have in my portfolio. The MERC Sniper. I should say the MERC Sniper, because when this started out, MERC's was not it wasn't MERC's yet. This was just a mercenary character that Keith Lowe drew. Keith and I went to college together. We were both illustration majors and graphic design majors, and he was an awesome illustrator, better than me, and I was getting really good at sculpting. And so I'm like, hey, rather than trying to come up with all these concepts myself and struggling with whether or not I thought my drawings were good enough, why don't I just team up with somebody and have them draw stuff, and I'll sculpt stuff, and we'll make miniatures and sell them. And that's what we did. Made this miniature, and let's see, I sculpted this one. I can't remember if I did just this one and put this single one out immediately, or if I waited until we had the second one done. I think I waited until we had the second one done, but this was, I spent a ton of time on this miniature. I was just so stoked about sculpting something so neat that Keith had drawn, and that I wanted to do, and something that would also start to become my own and not just working for another company. That I poured everything into this miniature, and to this day I think it's one of my best as far as quality goes. There's some things I could change, maybe thickening up the body and things like that, but there's a lot of really neat things going on with this miniature. You also notice here he doesn't have the ball cap on. It might be a little hard to tell, but when I was working for MegaCon Games, we actually, some people liked the ball cap. Some people thought it was too goofy. They wanted the character, to look a little bit more military, so we changed his headgear here to some sort of wrap, that he might be wearing underneath a helmet. So I prefer the ball cap, but there you go. If working for Magnificent Egos was a milestone in my career, well then, the first time I got to sculpt for Reaper Miniatures, it was a dream come true. This concept by Talon, it was just for a very simple dwarf sapper. I had done several dwarves before then, and when Reaper Ron asked me what I'd like to do, I was still on a major dwarf kick. And the dwarves I had done to that point really weren't kind of the style I really wanted to do, but I believe Ron saw me do a drawing of some dwarves, and he really liked the style and proportion. It might have been after I did this figure, but either way, Talon did an awesome artwork for this figure, and I love sculpting this. And this is, I was still in green stuff, so stuff still took me quite a while to sculpt, but I remember being at, I think I started this before a ReaperCon or Reaper Artist Con, and then I went there to finish it, and I remember Ron kind of teasing me that how long it was taking me to get some rivets done, and I was like, man, he's right, it is taking me forever, but that's just the kind of speed and mentality I was at that point. I didn't really have the, I don't know, I always feel like, you know, people talk about being talented versus skilled, and I really think, I don't want to sound full of myself, but I think I do have a lot of talent, because I shouldn't be able to sculpt as well as I do for the amount of time I put in. But with that said, everyone should and can be putting in time to get better, because, you know, my output over the years would have been easily doubled if I would have just, obviously, if you're putting in more time, it would be faster, but if I had put in the time to practice certain techniques to become faster and better and more reassured in what I was doing, I would have been able to knock out and tackle some of these potentially simple tasks that just seemed to take a long time, because it was almost like I was learning brand new every single time. But this is one of my favorite miniatures I've ever done. I just love the simple pose of him just kind of chilling out, and everything's just so clean, and the proportions on the dwarves, the Reaper dwarves and Talon style, I just absolutely love them. This next miniature was sculpted for Beaumont Minis, and I won't talk about it too long because I can't find any pictures or record at all of this miniature, but this was a really cool, it was a really neat concept. Matt Beeman drew this really fun cartoony style, and this was basically a big fire giant, and it was a larger miniature than I normally did, and in order to save time and get cheap material, I had gotten some samples of Aves epoxy sculpt, and that was my very first time working with it. But what I did with that is I just did pure Aves, no mixing, and I used that to bulk up the figure, and it was so messy and goopy, but it cured rock hard, and it was easy to just get large clumps. I think it's still a pretty good, viable technique to use for some of these larger miniatures, but yeah, it was rough because I was like, am I using this stuff right? What's wrong with it? And that's when later on I found out that most people that use Aves mix it with green stuff or something just to give it a little bit more substance to work with. But it's a really cool miniature. I think it was produced, but I haven't seen one in the wild in a long time. Thanks for watching another edition of Tom's Sculpting Archives. I hope it helped you see and understand just how you can develop over a year and over years as you watch the other archives from before and the ones I'm going to do in the future. Because in the end, what you really got to do is keep sculpting.